Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation, and for the slightly intimidating task of opening up this entire workshop or conference with the first talk. As you see, there's a slight change in my title. I've decided to call my talk Vernaculars of Informality rather than Vocabularies of Informality, because I wanted to stress the vernaculars aspect, so the everyday language of informality. This is a slightly unusual talk within the context, I think, of the conference, and even for me, because it's not really based on a single ethnographic kind of case or research, but rather partly on the work that I have done in the past and partly on a project which I ran with David Hennig, who's now at the University of Utrecht, a few years ago, which focused on collecting vernacular expressions mainly for informal economic practices. And so my talk is mainly looking at questions of informal economic practices, but I think a lot of this relates to informality in a wider sense as well. And the subtitle is From Languages of Interest to Languages of Affect, which kind of summarizes our main thrust with this project. And I should say everything today, or most things today, apart from when I refer to my specific own work, has been done in dialogue with David. Is also thinking about the way that we analyze informality or informal economic practices, often in terms of languages of interest. Whereas if you look, and we looked at this project, at the kind of vernacular languages, the way that people speak about these practices in everyday life, this is very much a language of affect. And I'll go a little bit more into it. So my talk really is partly theoretical, conceptual, thinking through what we might learn if we take vernaculars of informality seriously, and what conceptual kind of ideas might come out of that, and also a sort of overview over what we found out when we collected these words and these expressions, and some of the interesting observations, first observations that we made from that. So I'm not going to be sort of going into any kind of linguistics here. It's more looking at the tendencies and patterns and speculating what we might learn. So recent scholarship on economic and social sciences has been looking at informal economic activities and looking at the different cultural guises that this comes under, and how it reflects local histories and moral economies and socioeconomic contexts of various kinds. And we're all probably familiar with this literature. But while a lot of the literature is good at documenting the empirical diversity of informal economic practices, not many people have given serious thought to their discursive or their linguistic aspects. And what you tend to see is that when people do give reference to vernacular expressions of unofficial or illegal economic activity, it's usually used to add a kind of ethnographic color to academic writing. So people will, use the local terms, but they won't necessarily think very much about where those terms have arisen from. Or they might say, this is a little bit like, say, blatt. So you often see this in the literature that I'm familiar with, that people will take local terms and kind of compare it to a more generic term, or a term that's very strong in the theoretical literature. And in this paper, as I said before, I advocate, or we both advocate, me and David, that we take local vocabularies of informality seriously, because language is a constitutive part of all of these economic practices, as well as the models of corruption and informality through which scholars have studied them. This is the idea that a lot of the language that we use as scholars is precisely language of interest. So what can we, the idea is what can we find out if we think about the forms of communication rather than functional or systemic factors when looking at informal economies. And what we looked at was about 200 vernacular expressions for informal economic practices, which we drew from our own project, which we ran a few years ago, called Languages of Informality, and then also from the Global Encyclopedia of Informality, which is a project led by Alyona Ledneva at UCL, which is now several wonderful free access volumes looking at various different kinds of expressions. And our material covers both small and large-scale corruption, bribery, nepotism, and also commonplace terms for informal employment, enterprise, welfare, and different kinds of customs and kinship networks, which dictate how resources are shared and distributed. And surveying this collection of terms, we kind of discovered several things. And one thing was that vocabularies of informality or vernaculars of informality operate along hierarchies of scale. So words for large scale or elite informal economies are usually derived from incidents of corporate fraud or public corruption. And in contrast, terms that are more commonplace or for more commonplace economic practices refer to everyday situations and categories. And we found that there's these groupings around certain kinds of metaphors. So there's lots of references to food and drink or sharing food and drink. There's metaphors of concealment, metaphors of movement, and kind of references to different types of human relationships, kinship relationships, or social relationships that stand outside of informality in itself. And the second thing we found looking at this collection of words is that vocabularies of informality or vernaculars of informality operate through a language of affect in both senses of the word. So they often refer to sentiments and social ties, but what we want to stress is that we can also see this language as moving people to act by appealing to feelings of duty and empathy, as well as any kind of instrumental need or desire for wealth or for power. And the kind of inspiration to thinking about vernaculars of informality or thinking of language and informality together came from a lot of different things, but one of the big kind of senses of or sources of inspiration for me was this kind of rhetorical turn that has been in economic anthropology over the last few years. So there's a number of anthropologists who have turned their attention towards studying how language shapes the way that people make economic judgments or see the economy, and who view the economy as a product of not just practices, but also of words, of rhetoric, of persuasion. And so you have a range of ethnographers studying everything from financial markets to popular culture, who have produced lots of interesting evidence about how economic transactions are animated through language. So money talks, dollars are happy or sad, markets are the artifacts of words. This is Douglas Holmes. Capital is manic, markets are depressive. That's Emily Martin. And language fails in the world of derivative finance. That's Appadurai. So they share an interest with a number of economic sociologists who've also been writing about how economic decision-making and how markets, financial markets, are shaped by circulating economic theories and business strategies and speculations about future profitability. And this is people like Jens Beckert, who's written a lot around this. And there's also some scholars who've been interested in discourse, like Doreen Massey, who argue that contemporary neoliberal capitalism is very discursive in character And they argue that language itself constructs the hegemonic order of global capitalism, extending concepts and terminologies of the market into different domains. So there's this idea that the economy is shaped by language, yet also, you know, languages or languages of the market are spreading into other areas. So all of these works are united by a common focus on the way that economic intentions and actions are expressed, and not just functions and their outcomes. And they view the economy and the economic as operating through a kind of persuasive language. And despite the fact that, you know, these works are all works that really relate to what we might call the formal side of economies rather than the informal economic practices, I think pursuing a similar approach to informal economic practices or institutions is a fruitful way of supplementing conventional systemic or political economic approaches. But I also think that doing this, you need to rethink, or we need to rethink, common approaches to the study of informality, and that's some of the things here that I've written up. So I think the one thing is that we need to take vernacular vocabularies of informality seriously and regard them as being as conceptually powerful as the language of the market. So if there's this idea that the language of the market is powerful and language is powerful in shaping the market, then we should apply this to this sphere as well. And there's a lot of assumption if you read some of the literature on informality, particularly perhaps more the political science literature or the sociological literature, that informal economic activities are actually not articulated, or that they escape articulation, at least in official discourse. So there's this idea of unwritten rules and open secrets and so on. So the lack of articulation. And also there's an idea that popular euphemisms for informality are actually about concealment. So they're about concealing the exact nature of informal economic practices or diverting attention away from their negative outcomes. So actually language is just seen as a vehicle of kind of covering up what's actually going on. But what we advocate is that taking vocabularies of informality seriously makes us think more about the articulation of informality, both inside and outside of official discourse, as kind of a constitutive part of economic practices themselves. And the second thing I think we need to challenge ourselves when we think about or informality is when people are talking about informality, and particularly informal economic practices, what is it they're actually talking about, and why, and what is persuasive about their language of informality? And this is something I kind of thought a bit about when I was doing my own field work in Poland, where people would often tell me about their informal economic activities, and particularly male entrepreneurs would often, you know, right off the bat, first time I'd ever met them, tell me all about how they were running their businesses through kombinowanie, which is kind of a typical Polish word for kind of informal kind of activities. And I was really surprised by this, not necessarily because you know, of the informality, and lots of people talk about that in Central Europe, but why they were sometimes even describing things which didn't fall in under kind of informal economic activities. And usually, you know, this was what this word is used for, but they would persist on calling it kombinowanie. And really what it made me think, and this is an article I wrote a few years ago, was what is it exactly they were conveying with kombinowanie? And this was much more about local ideas of agency, identity, attitudes to the state, masculinity, and so on, rather than the actual nitty-gritty of, you know, their tax fraud and other things they were talking about. So what do people actually talk about, and why is that language persuasive when they're talking informality? And finally, also, I think it's important to take these vernaculars seriously because they tell us something about the concepts and models of economic agency or even social agency that are existing in local contexts. And I think sometimes this brings us to consider informality in relation to things that we usually don't consider it in relation to, things like charity or ritual exchange or things like that, rather than thinking only in terms of formal, informal, or what is typical for an anthropologist, putting these sorts of transactions or relationships within kind of age-old anthropological categories like gift or commodity exchange or market versus community economy or debt and obligation. So kind of trying to explode away from that. Right, so what did we find out when we looked at these words and at this collection of words that we put together? And just kind of, I wrote here global findings because these are sort of two big observations. And I want to stress that this isn't sort of some sort of statistically complete set. This is derived from asking people and advertising people to submit to us various different words and then supplementing it with extra things in the encyclopedia. And one thing which was really interesting was that people are aware of the connection of informality and informal economic practices and language themselves. So you have a whole collection within this collection of words, which is really interesting words that refer to language itself, either a designation for a kind of criminal code or slang. So you have the French verlan, which is a vernacular language that was originally developed by petty criminals and now is a type of slang. Or you have a really interesting one from Uganda, which is called Uganda language or talking well, and is really a reference to the fact that people acknowledge consciously or unconsciously that words and expressions in speaking are pivotal to making these kinds of informal transactions or connections or whatever it is, networks function. And then when we looked sort of globally at the kinds of words we got submitted from different places, there was also a slight difference. So a lot of the words that came from people working in the global north were words for large-scale corporate or government fraud and activities like lobbying that were on the boundary between government and private business. So were seen as somehow dirty, even though they weren't necessarily illegal. The words from sub-Saharan Africa and Asia and Central America were usually the more everyday kind of petty corruption, bribery of policemen, officials, things like that. And then you had Central Eastern Europe and Middle East and Central Asia, where you had words kind of falling in both one and the other category. And another thing that we found was that large-scale corruption and fraud had a vocabulary of its own. And this was often vocabulary that was created by the media. And it was derived from either specific incidents of corporate fraud and public corruption, or specific periods of socioeconomic transformation that allowed corruption to flourish. And so you have cases like cash for questions, which was a point in the 1990s where a British lobbyist had bribed 2 parliament members to table questions in parliament on behalf of the then owner of Harrods, Mohammed Al-Fayed, or the Italian Tangentopoli, which is Italian for Bribesville. And this was a word that combined tangente, meaning kickback, and poli, meaning city. So it was about kickbacks that were given to politicians who had awarded certain companies public work contracts. In the kind of specific periods of socioeconomic transition, there's something that the Czech people are going to recognize here, tunelovanie or tunelovanie in Slovak, and this is a term used for large-scale financial fraud in the management of the company as it drains its resources to other companies owned by this management. So it's about tunneling out kind of the profits and the resources. And then you have this special category of terms that covers powerful people who, by virtue of their seniority or ranking or family and political connections, have a kind of position as the nexus of informal networks or crime syndicates, and who have the power to redistribute legitimate or illegitimate resources. And here you have, and these are typical in places where certain families and organizations are highly concentrated, so Japan and Korea, or where kinships and clan relations are the key to access to political power and positions, so Central Asia and the Caucasus. And we had this word barone, which was from Italy, so people who use their authority within their profession to exercise power. And the terms for informal activities and small-scale corruption tend to be much more colorful, and they refer to everyday situations according to different categories. So references to human relationships. So you have several places where there's references to kind of godparenthood. So compadrazgo and cumstvo, they're both references. They're both the use of godparenthood. So there's this kind of talk of informal networks based on notions of fictive kinships. So like blood relatives, people in this, kumovia, or people in this relationship are supposed to help each other all the way through life, even if this means breaking rules and going against good practice. And, in other places, these things are usually called connections in various different kinds, vriski or vruski. And then you have interesting collections about gifting and things that are referencing pride. And this is, I've put up an Azeri word. I'm not going to try and pronounce it because I have no idea how to pronounce it. But this is in Azerbaijan, where you have a common word used for bribe, which is actually interchangeable with a word used for respect. So an official requesting a bribe will ask them to ask you to do him a favor or actually to pay him respect. And it's interesting that there's this overlap. And then you have a lot of metaphors of concealment and movement. So you have a lot of countries where envelopes are referenced. So here you have the Italian and the Greek for envelope. In Hungary, this word means oiling money. And then you have a lot of countries where you have a kind of combination of concealment of movement. So this idea of paying under the table. And here again, the French, you have it in Farsi, you have it in Swedish, and so on. And finally, you have a really large collection of references to food. A sense of, or police might ask for pourboire in Côte d'Ivoire. You have a Brazilian term for a bribe, which is a little coffee. And in Afghanistan and Iran, you have the same expression, which is meaning tea or money for tea. And in these countries, tea drinking is an essential part of social life. So asking for money for tea carries the kind of suggestion that there's going to be some kind of sociality, or that the bribe might be shared with other people. And I think this is really interesting because in these references to food, you also have this kind of recasting of actions of exchange or bribery or gifting in terms of morally positive actions such as sharing or tipping or charity or other things. And I think this is, again, this question of a language of affect rather than a language of interest. And across the globe, you have a lot of euphemisms that draw on local traditions of food provisioning and cooking. So this idea of feeding, kормlenie in Russian, and ideas of eating. Here you have the Tanzanian for eating. And there's this seemingly universal use of metaphors which connect petty corruption with food, and it really indicates the degree to which such practices are connected to both the pragmatic need to survival, but also these ideas of obligations to share and distribute windfall with friends and relatives. So I think I've run out of time already, so I'll just draw my conclusions. And really in this paper, I've suggested that if we take vocabularies or vernaculars seriously, it can open up novel theoretical and methodological avenues for studying informal economic practices and informality more widely. And scholars studying the formal aspects of the economy, such as financial markets and fiscal policy, have shown that language operates, or that these markets operate through and are shaped by pervasive or persuasive language. And what we advocate is that taking the same approach to vernaculars of informality opens up the possibility of viewing this language as performative rather than just connotative. So as a constitutive part of informal economic practices and informality in general. And it opens up the possibility for gaining certain conceptual insights about local concepts of enumeration or value, of morality and social and economic agency, enriching our ways of understanding how these activities reflect local histories or moral economies. But more importantly, I want to stress that it opens up the possibility of challenging the notion that vernaculars of informality are just euphemisms that facilitate a kind of misrecognition of informal relations and transactions as effective. So if one reads a lot of the literature from political science, sociology, economics in particular, but even some anthropology, there's this notion that informality is really about instrumental exchanges, and that the motivation for engaging in these practices is about economic necessity or economic opportunism. And so existing approaches really employ an analytical approach rooted in the language of kind of interest, of instrumentality, of cost benefit. And they classify informal economic transactions in terms of investment or negotiation or questions of return, or if you're an anthropologist, gift, commodity, and debt. And while we don't really contest that need or greed motivates people to engage in informal economic practices, but I think what we argue is that there's a lot of meaning lost in this kind of gap that happens between an academic analytical language, which is about interest, and a kind of language of affect of the everyday life. And yeah, I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much.